Beatrice was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. A light autumnal rain fell against the window. She glanced at the clock, 7:30. Thomas was about to come down for breakfast. "Good morning," Beatrice said, hearing his footsteps on the stairs. Thomas entered the kitchen, wearing a new navy blue suit. Beatrice noticed the faint scent of his cologne. "Have you changed your perfume?" she asked, placing a plate of scrambled eggs in front of him. "Oh, yes, a birthday gift from the team," he replied, without looking up from his phone. Beatrice sat opposite him. "But your birthday was 3 months ago." "Jesus, Beatrice, you always have to be in control," Thomas said, irritated. "Of course," she replied quietly. "It's just that you know what?" he interrupted. "It's becoming unbearable. I work all day, providing us with a decent life, and all you do is ask stupid questions." Beatrice felt tears welling up in her eyes. "I didn't mean to upset you. It's just that you've been different lately." "Different?" He laughed. "Maybe because I'm developing, progressing. And what have you done in the last 15 years besides staying at home?" "I gave up my career for our family." Her voice trembled. "You asked me to," Thomas said, rising from the table. "And here's another reproach. You remind me of your great sacrifice." "Yes, you were a journalist for a women's magazine, one of the most popular ones." Beatrice whispered. "I was, darling, I was," he said, picking up his briefcase. "I'll be late tonight. I have an important meeting with a client." Beatrice looked at the half-eaten breakfast. "You haven't even had breakfast." "I'll eat at the office," he said, and left the kitchen, slamming the front door. The silence in the house became unbearable. Beatrice went to the window and watched Thomas get into his car. His phone rang, and she saw him smile as he looked at the screen. Beatrice spent the whole day doing housework, washing Thomas's clothes, and again noticing the same woman's perfume on his shirt. It wasn't hers. In the evening, the phone rang. Beatrice heard Thomas's voice. "Don't wait up for me tonight. I have an important presentation for a client." "Okay," she replied. "And one more thing," he said coldly. "There's a charity event at the company on Friday. You have to come with me." "Okay," she said again. "What time?" "I'll send you the details." "And Beatrice, wear something decent, not like last time." He hung up without waiting for her response. Beatrice sat on the sofa, staring out the window. She remembered their first meeting 15 years ago. She had interviewed him for an article on successful young entrepreneurs. Back then, he had admired her professionalism, her independence, her ambition. When had everything changed? Thomas returned after 11 p.m., smelling of whiskey. "How was the presentation?" Beatrice asked. "Fine," he grunted. "I'm going to bed." Thomas braced himself. "Maybe we should talk." He paused on the stairs. "About what's going on? What's happening?" Beatrice turned to him. "What exactly worries you?" "You've changed. These late meetings. The new password on your phone. You were trying to check my phone." Her eyes narrowed. That's great. That's great. You know what? I'm tired. I'm tired of your suspicions. Your paranoia. Maybe if you were doing something more useful than spying on me, you wouldn't be inventing nonsense." He went upstairs, leaving her alone in the dark living room. Beatrice felt tears streaming down her cheeks. She didn't know what she feared more, the confirmation of her suspicions, or the realization that she had lost herself in this marriage. The next day, she began to prepare for the charity event. Beatrice took out the black dress she had bought last year. Thomas had said she looked old in it. Maybe she should buy a new one. Would that change anything? She looked at herself in the mirror. At 42, she was still an attractive woman, although Thomas hadn't noticed for a long time. When had he last said something nice to her? When had he last looked at her with the same tenderness as 15 years before? Beatrice picked up her phone and dialed her friend Martha's number. A familiar voice answered. "Martha," Beatrice whispered. "I think I have a problem." Beatrice was sitting in Martha's office, her friend listening attentively to her story. "Maybe I'm exaggerating," Beatrice said, swirling her teacup. "Lately, he's been working a lot." Martha shook her head. "Beatrice, you're not stupid. New perfume, passwords on the phone, late meetings. But that doesn't mean anything." Beatrice interrupted. "Maybe I've become too suspicious." Martha put down her cup. "How long has it been since he last told you he loved you?" Beatrice froze. She tried to remember, but couldn't. "It doesn't matter," she said quietly. "We've been married for 15 years. Not all couples talk about their feelings every day. Compliments, gifts, attention." Beatrice felt a tightness in her chest. You don't understand. Thomas is too busy to notice his own wife. Martha looked directly into her eyes. At home, Beatrice stood for a long time in front of the bathroom mirror, trying to see herself through Thomas's eyes. What had changed? When had he stopped looking at her with love? The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Yes, Thomas. I won't be home tonight. I have an urgent meeting with foreign partners. Don't wait up for me. Okay, she replied. But he had already hung up. Beatrice went downstairs. Thomas's unfinished morning coffee was on the table. She began to clear the table mechanically, and suddenly noticed his phone, his work phone. Her hands trembled as she picked up the device. The screen lit up. The phone wasn't locked. I shouldn't do this, she thought, but her fingers were already scrolling through the messages. Good morning, darling. Read a message from Lindsay. Looking forward to our dinner. Last night was amazing. You're so special. Beatrice felt nauseous. Dozens, hundreds of messages over the past months. Your wife doesn't suspect anything. She's too busy with the garden and housework. You deserve more than a housewife. Beatrice dropped the phone onto the table. Her legs felt weak. She sat down in a chair and covered her face with her hands. Memories flooded back. All those late nights. The weekends he was away. The excuses and lies. The phone vibrated. A new message from Lindsay. Don't forget our weekend at the cottage. Beatrice felt a sharp pain in her chest. Their cottage. The place where they had spent their happiest moments. Where they had dreamed of the future. She heard the sound of a car. Thomas was back. Beatrice quickly hung up the phone and went upstairs. She heard his voice. Yes, I'm in the bedroom, she replied, trying to keep her voice normal. Thomas came into the room. Oh, right, I forgot my work phone. Did you see it in the kitchen? Yes, she replied, without turning to him. What's wrong with your voice? Have you been crying? I'm just tired. I have a headache. He was silent. Well, I have to go. I have an important meeting with Lindsay. He almost said Lindsay, but stopped himself. Yes, of course. Have a good day. When he left, Beatrice sat on the bed, remembering all the times she had tried to convince herself that everything was all right. All the excuses she had made to justify his behavior. She went to the window and watched him get into his car. Her husband, the man she trusted with her life. A man who had not only betrayed her trust but also their life together. Their dreams, their future. Beatrice's phone vibrated. A message from Martha. How are you? She stared at the screen for a long time, not knowing what to say. How to describe the moment when your world crumbles. How to explain the pain of realizing that 15 years of your life were built on a lie. You were right, she finally wrote. He's cheating on me. Beatrice looked at her reflection in the window. She wasn't crying anymore. Instead, a different expression appeared in her eyes. Determination. She thought of the cottage. Their weekend. Maybe it was time to act. Beatrice sat in the empty house. The silence weighed heavily on her ears. She looked at their wedding photo on the wall. A young, smiling couple. She in a white dress. He in a dark suit. They looked so happy. You were so naive, she whispered to her younger self. The phone rang. It was Martha. Beatrice, I'm worried about you. Should I come over? No, Beatrice said, her voice no longer weary. I need to be alone. You don't have to go through this alone. You know, I remember the first time I met Thomas. Beatrice ignored her friend's words. I interviewed him, she said. He said he was impressed by my professionalism, my ambition, and then he did everything he could to destroy those ambitions. You let him, Martha said softly. Beatrice went to the closet and took out an old file. Look what I found. What is it? My old articles. Best journalism of the year. Remember, you were the star of the newsroom. Beatrice opened the folder. Yellowed magazine clippings staring back at her from the past. And then Thomas said a real family needed total commitment. That their children deserved a stay-at-home mother. The children's voices trembled. The ones we never had. Beatrice whispered, not listening. I remember the night I told him about my new position as head editor of the department. Do you know what he said? Darling, but who will take care of our house then? The doorbell rang. Martha entered, despite her friend's protests. I brought wine, she said, hugging Beatrice. They sat on the terrace. Beatrice looked at her garden. The only place where she still felt herself. Do you remember that night at the Christmas party? She asked suddenly. 3 years ago, I was wearing a red dress. Thomas introduced me to his colleagues and said, and this is my wife. She's just a housewife, but she cooks very well. And I was smiling. God, I was smiling. Beatrice finished her wine. You know what's worse? I really believed that being just a housewife was normal. That my dreams, my ambitions, were something bad. Martha took her hand. You have to tell him what you know about Lindsay. Beatrice shook her head. It's not the right time. What do you mean? Beatrice stood up and walked to the edge of the terrace. I want him to understand. Not just what I know about the betrayal, but who I was, who I am. The phone rang. Thomas, she said. Yes, darling. His voice sounded calm, almost cheerful. I'll be late tonight. I didn't even say goodbye. I have an important presentation. Of course, darling. With Lindsay. She couldn't hold back a pause. What do you mean? His voice became tense. Well, she's your assistant. She's probably helping with the presentation. Yes, of course. Yes, of course. He visibly relaxed. Don't wait up for dinner. Beatrice hung up and looked at Martha. See, he didn't even suspect. To him, I'm just a stupid housewife who doesn't notice anything. And what are you going to do? Beatrice went to the table and picked up her old laptop. You know, I write a gardening blog. A little hobby for a stupid housewife. And I have 90,000 subscribers. I never told Thomas. He thinks I'm just playing around. Martha looked at her friend in surprise. Are you serious? Thomas, of course. And you know what? Last month, they offered me a book contract. The contract is already signed. Beatrice smiled bitterly. Thomas doesn't even know. He's never been interested in my stupid hobby. And now he's planning to spend the weekend with Lindsay at our country house. And what are you going to do? Beatrice closed the laptop. Nothing. For now. He thinks I'm still the same naive housewife. But do you know what I've learned in these 15 years? That the worst thing isn't the betrayal. The worst thing is betraying yourself. She went to the window. Outside, it was getting dark. Somewhere in the city, her husband was having dinner with his lover. And she was here, in the house that had become her prison. And for the first time in many years, she felt free. You're stronger than you think, Martha said. I know, Beatrice replied. And soon, everyone will know. Thursday began as usual. Beatrice was preparing breakfast when Thomas came downstairs. Good morning, she said, putting a plate of scrambled eggs in front of him. Thomas simply nodded without looking up from his phone. Suddenly, he looked up. By the way, I was thinking about your garden. I think we should redo it. Hire a real landscaper. Your amateur attempts look, well, you know. Beatrice felt a tightening in her chest. But I've been working on this garden for 5 years. People even ask me for advice. People? He laughed. You mean your 3 followers on that ridiculous blog? Please, Beatrice, don't make a fool of yourself. I have 90,000 followers. She said quietly. What? Thomas stopped laughing. Don't be ridiculous. You don't even know anything about social media. I can teach you. He abruptly stood up from the table. You know what bothers me most? Your constant need to prove you're worthwhile. You're a housewife. Beatrice, get over it. She stood there, watching him gather his things. As he was about to leave, he added, remove those horrible roses from the front. Lindsay said they're not fashionable anymore. Lindsay, Beatrice felt her voice tremble. Yes, she has very good taste. Unlike, she didn't finish, but her eyes said it all. When the door closed behind him, Beatrice slowly sank into a chair. Her hands trembled. She took out her phone and opened her blog, 93,000 subscribers. Her last post about growing roses had received thousands of likes and comments. Suddenly, she heard the sound of a car. Thomas had returned. He'd forgotten something. Beatrice looked out the window and froze. Another car pulled up in front of her house. Lindsay got out. Beatrice quickly moved away from the window and leaned against the wall. Her heart pounded. Are you sure he doesn't suspect anything? She heard Lindsay say. Absolutely. She's too busy with her flowers. Thomas replied in his usual dismissive tone. What did you tell her about the weekend? The same thing I always tell her, an important business trip. Beatrice held her breath. A whole weekend together, Lindsay purred. Yes, darling, I've already made all the arrangements. And she doesn't even know where the house keys are. Thomas laughed. The last time she was there was a year ago. Beatrice smiled silently. The keys were in her jewelry box. A wedding gift from her mother-in-law that Thomas hated. Okay, darling, I have to go to work. Thomas said. See you tonight. I can't wait. Lindsay replied. Beatrice heard the sound of a kiss. Then 2 cars driving away. She slowly slid down the wall to the floor. Her phone vibrated. A message from her editor. Dear Mrs. Coleman, we'd like to remind you of our meeting next week regarding your book. She looked at the message, then stood up and went to the mirror. There were no tears in her eyes, only determination. Beatrice dialed Martha's number. You said I had to act. I know what I have to do. What are you planning? I can't tell you yet, but I need your help. You know I'm always on your side. Martha replied. Beatrice looked out the window. And one more thing, could you lend me your camera? The one we used for our wedding? Why? Let's just say I want to capture some important moments. It was a rainy Friday. Beatrice was in the middle of the living room of the country house, with a box of old photographs in her hands. The dust on the furniture showed that no one had been there for a long time. Are you sure you want to do this? Martha asked, unpacking the camera. Beatrice took out the wedding photo and put it on the mantelpiece. Do you know what he said that day? You're the best thing that's ever happened to me. She took out another photo from their first vacation in this house. And this is our first New Year's Eve here. We said we'd be the happiest family in the world. Beatrice, wait, Martha said, opening the old box. Look at all his letters to you. You're my life, forever yours. Martha came closer and hugged her friend. You don't have to go through this. Beatrice wiped away a tear. You know why? Because he has to see. He has to understand what he's destroyed. She began placing the photos all over the house. On every table, every shelf, evidence of their former happiness. And what's this? Martha picked up an old notebook. My diary. I wrote down every special moment. Beatrice smiled bitterly. Every compliment he gave me. Every promise he made. She opened the first page. Today, Thomas said he was proud of me. That my devotion to my family is my most valuable gift. When was this written? The day I resigned as head editor. Beatrice looked out the window. They'll come tomorrow night. He'll show her the house. Tell her about his successes. And at every turn, they'll be met by these photographs. These memories. Do you think it will change anything? I don't know, Beatrice replied honestly, but I want him to remember. I want him to know that he didn't just betray his wife. He betrayed our dreams, our future. Martha checked the cameras. Everything is ready. You'll be able to see every corner of the house. Good. Beatrice sat down in a chair. Sometimes I wake up at night and think, maybe it's all my fault. Maybe if I had been different. Don't you dare say that. Her voice trembled. Something in me. Martha took her friend's hands. Listen, you are a wonderful woman. Talented and intelligent. Kind. He was the one who lost the ability to see that. Beatrice stood up and went to the fireplace. On the mantelpiece was their last photograph together. From Christmas last year. Even then, she could see how he avoided her gaze. Sometimes I doubt, she whispered. Am I doing the right thing? Should I talk to him? Give him a chance to deny everything? Invent new excuses? Martha shook her head. No, no more talking, no more excuses. Beatrice took the last item from her bag, the first photo of them together. From that interview 15 years ago. She placed it in the center of the table. It will be the first thing they see when they come in. She said, the beginning of our story. And the beginning of his end. Martha looked at her watch. We should go. Are you sure you want to stay in the guest house? Yes. Beatrice took one last look around the room. I need to see this. I need to know the truth. They left the house. The rain had stopped, but the air was heavy with humidity. Like her heart, heavy with unexpressed pain. Call me if you need anything, Martha said as she got into the car. Beatrice nodded, watching her friend drive away, leaving her alone with her plans, her doubts, and her pain. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, her husband and his lover would come. And every photograph, every letter, every memory would be a silent witness to his betrayal. Beatrice entered the guest house and went to the window. From there, she could see the main house. The place where they had once been happy. The place where tomorrow, the end of their marriage, would begin. Saturday was a sunny day. Beatrice woke up early in the guest house. She had barely slept that night. Attentive to every sound, her phone vibrated. A message from Martha. How are you? Beatrice didn't reply. She waited, sitting by the window. Thomas had sent her a message that morning. I have an important meeting in the country. An important meeting, she whispered, looking at the laptop screen displaying the images from the camera. At 4 o'clock, she heard the sound of a car, and her heart sank. Thomas's black BMW appeared at the entrance. Oh, darling, it's beautiful. Lindsay's voice echoed in the silence of the estate. Beatrice watched them get out of the car. Thomas put his arm around Lindsay's waist, a gesture that was very familiar. He had embraced her like that once. Wait until you see the inside of the house, he said, taking the suitcases out of the trunk. Beatrice switched the camera to the living room. They entered, and the first thing they saw was a photo of them together on the table. Lindsay approached. It's you. You look so young. Thomas picked up the photograph. Surprised. This is strange. I don't remember this being here. Who's this with you? It's Beatrice. When she was still a journalist. Beatrice saw his expression change. For a moment, there was something in his eyes, regret. Oh, your wife. Lindsay grimaced. What are all these old photographs for? They continued on. Every step, every turn, was met with new memories. Tom, there are photos of you everywhere. Lindsay sounded irritated. Beatrice watched them climb the stairs. Thomas seemed confused. I don't understand, he said. They hadn't been here in almost a year. In the bedroom, they found her old letters spread across the bed. Beatrice saw Lindsay pick one up. To my only love. Thomas snatched the letter from Lindsay's hands. That was a long time ago. But why are they here now? Beatrice watched as her husband sat on their bed, where they had spent so many happy moments. Lindsay suggested they go to a hotel. There's too much of the past here. No, Thomas said quietly. This is my home, our home, Beatrice whispered. Watching the screen, she saw them come down the stairs. Thomas trying to pretend everything was normal. Lindsay increasingly irritated as she found more photos. Let's have some wine, Thomas suggested, heading for the cellar, the place where Beatrice and he had once dreamed of their future. There, the wedding album awaited. Beatrice could see his hands tremble as he turned the pages. Thomas called Lindsay from upstairs. How much longer will you be? But he didn't answer. He was looking at the photographs, their smiling faces. The time when they were truly happy. Beatrice wiped away tears. She hadn't expected it to hurt so much. Seeing him here with another woman. Touching her, smiling at her. Suddenly, her phone vibrated. A message from Thomas. Everything okay at home? The meeting is running late. She smiled bitterly as she looked at the screen, where Thomas was embracing Lindsay. Yes, darling, everything is going very well. Evening fell on the country house. Beatrice, sitting in the darkness, watched the two figures dining at her table, drinking wine from her glasses, laughing as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She took out her old diary and began to write. Today, I saw my past die. But tomorrow, my future will begin. The sun had barely risen when Beatrice heard voices coming from the main house. In the kitchen, Lindsay was making coffee, and Thomas was reading the news on his phone. Beatrice put on her beige suit, the same one she wore for her last interview. 15 years ago, she went to the mirror and fixed her hair. Her heart was pounding, but she was calm. The phone rang loudly in the morning silence. What the hell? She heard Thomas's irritated voice. The door burst open. Thomas froze, his face contorted with rage. What the hell are you doing here? Good morning, darling, Beatrice said calmly as she entered the house. You've been following me? He grabbed her arm. You're crazy. What's going on? Lindsay appeared in the hallway and stopped abruptly. Oh, Lindsay smiled at Beatrice. How could you sleep in my bed? Shut up, Thomas barked, squeezing her hand tighter. You have no right. This is my house, darling. Our house, isn't it? Thomas released her hand and laughed. Cold and cruel. Your home? And what have you done for this home? Sitting here, watering your pathetic flowers. God, it's disgusting to see you old and boring. A housewife. Lindsay started to walk away from the stairs. I'd better go. Stay here, Thomas shouted. Let her see what a real woman is. He went to Lindsay and embraced her defiantly. See, Beatrice, see what a woman is. Not this laughingstock you've become. Thomas whispered to Lindsay. You know what's funny? She actually thought I loved her. That she was special. God, how naive she is. Look at her, a pathetic housewife who pretends to be a writer. Her blog is a joke. 90,000 subscribers. She lies to herself. As always, Beatrice remained motionless. I'm not lying. Oh, so you're also a liar? She approached. Do you know why I married you? Because you were convenient, submissive, willing to give up everything for love. You're so pathetic. Thomas. Enough. Lindsay tried to intervene. Shut up. He turned sharply towards her. Do you think it'll be different with you? You're as stupid as she is. Beatrice took out her phone. Do you know what this is? Darling, it's a book contract. A real contract. From a real publishing house. Thomas snatched the phone and threw it on the floor. Really? Do you think anyone wants to read your nonsense? That you can write something? You're nobody, an old, useless, uninteresting woman. He picked up their wedding photo from the table and threw it against the wall. Look at you then. And now, what's left of you? 15 years I've endured your insignificance. 15 years pretending I didn't find you repulsive. Lindsay picked up her bag. You're sick. Where are you going? He turned to her. Do you think you're better than that? You're as stupid as she is. You're all the same. Beatrice calmly picked up her phone. You know what's funny, Thomas? That all of this, every word you say, every gesture is recorded. And do you know what I'm going to do with it? His face changed. You wouldn't dare. No, darling, I'm not going to blackmail you. I'm just going to show the world who you really are. In my book, on my blog, everywhere. Nobody will believe you. I already have 93,000 subscribers. And you know what? That's just the beginning. She walked towards the door and turned around. Goodbye, Thomas. Thanks for finally showing your true face. Beatrice was sitting in Martha's office. 3 days had passed since that morning scene at the country house. 3 days of silence. He called, Martha asked. Pouring tea. No, Beatrice shook her head, but he took his things from the house while I was out. Martha sat beside her, and Lindsay sent me a message yesterday. Beatrice took out her phone. She wants to meet. And you're going? I think we both need it. The coffee was almost empty when Beatrice arrived for the appointment. Lindsay was already waiting, pale and with eyes red from lack of sleep. Thank you for seeing me, Lindsay said quietly. Why did you want to see me? Lindsay was silent for a long time, twirling her coffee cup. There's something I have to tell you. It's about Thomas. I'm not sure I want to. You should know, Lindsay interrupted. I'm not the first, and I won't be the last. Beatrice felt a chill run through her. What do you mean? There are others? At the office? He's used everyone. Tell me, Beatrice asked quietly. Last year, there was Catherine from the marketing department. Then Michelle from accounting. He promised them the same thing he promised me, that he would leave his wife. That we would be together. Beatrice sat in silence, listening to one story after another. Each new story was like a knife in her heart. Why are you telling me this? She finally asked. Lindsay looked up. Because I saw how he treated you in that house. The way he spoke, it was horrible. And I realized I would be next. Or someone else. And what did you do? I left. Lindsay smiled bitterly. I can't work there anymore. Not after everything. They sat in silence. It started to rain. You know, Lindsay said suddenly. I've seen your blog. It's beautiful. Beatrice looked at her in surprise. Seriously? Yes. And you're not boring, old, and uninteresting. He's just a monster. Beatrice returned home late that night. There was an envelope in the mailbox, divorce papers from Thomas's lawyer. She sat down in front of her computer and opened her blog, 100,000 subscribers. Dozens of supportive messages from women who had gone through the same thing in the comments. The phone rang. Thomas. Yes, I'm listening, she said calmly. Are you satisfied? Lindsay quit. There are rumors at the office. It wasn't me, it was you, Thomas. You destroyed everything. She didn't shout, but her voice was firm. You destroyed everything with your lies. Your cruelty. Your contempt for everyone who loved you. I filed for divorce. I know. The papers are here. Pause. You're not going to get anything. No house. No money. Nothing. I don't want anything of yours. Thomas. I have something much more valuable. What? Freedom. It's true. He hung up. She looked out the window. On the windowsill, her favorite orchid bloomed, the one Thomas had called a waste of time. Beatrice was sitting in her lawyer's office, rereading the divorce papers. Her husband had refused to sign them, so the case would go to court. The courtroom was almost empty. Beatrice nervously reviewed the papers. It was her third divorce hearing in the last month. Don't worry, Elizabeth, her lawyer said softly. We have a strong position. Thomas was sitting on the other side of the room with his lawyer. He looked tired but still belligerent. Mr. Coleman insists on selling the house and splitting the profits. His lawyer said, as Mrs. Coleman didn't officially work during the marriage, she has no right to. Excuse me, Elizabeth interrupted. We have documents proving that Mrs. Coleman has received regular payments from the gardening magazine Green Home for the past 5 years. We also have a contract with her book publisher. The judge carefully examined the documents. It says here that Mrs. Coleman wrote a column under the pseudonym Rose Garden, writing articles on gardening and home design. And how much income did she receive? An average of $1,200 a month. All the money was used for the upkeep of the house and garden. Thomas stood up, surprised. That's a lie. She never. Mr. Coleman, the judge interrupted. There are bank statements here confirming his wife's story. Beatrice took out another folder. I also want to submit documents about my blog and contracts with advertisers. In the last 3 months, my blog's income has amounted to $8,000. She saw Thomas's face change. He had never been interested in her stupid hobby. He had no idea she was making money. After 2 hours of deliberation, the court reached a decision. The house remained in Beatrice's possession. As she had demonstrated her financial contribution to its upkeep, Thomas had to compensate her for the years she had dedicated to housework. As they left the courthouse, Thomas caught up with her. You took care of everything, didn't you? You've been hiding your earnings all this time. No, Thomas. It's just that you never asked. You were never interested, and my reputation, his voice dropped. Those statements from my employees. I didn't tell anyone. They came to me after Lindsay quit. That afternoon, Beatrice was sitting in the kitchen with Martha. It's over, her friend asked. Almost. Beatrice opened her laptop. There were still a few formalities to take care of. A message appeared on the screen from the magazine editor. Your new article on garden recovery after winter is wonderful. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't started writing. If I had just taken it all silently. But you didn't. Martha smiled. And you know what? You'll never do it again. The following week, Beatrice received a letter from Thomas's lawyer. The company had conducted an internal investigation into his behavior with employees. He had been demoted and put on probation. How are you? Martha asked when Beatrice told her. I'm fine, she replied. You know, I don't feel happy, just relieved, as if I can finally breathe. Beatrice was sitting in her garden, among the blooming roses. Her phone blinked. A new message from the publisher. The first chapter of your book is excellent. She looked at her garden, living proof that even after the coldest winter, spring arrives. You just have to keep going and keep working. Months after the divorce, Beatrice was sitting in her office, what used to be a living room. Now there was a comfortable desk, a new computer, and shelves on the wall. There were diplomas from the digital marketing and landscape design courses she had taken in recent months. A call interrupted her work on the article. It was Lindsay. Her voice sounded worried. Yes, of course. Is something wrong? Thomas has been trying to contact me. He says he's changed, that he's realized everything. Beatrice sighed. And how do you feel? I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if he's really changed. Lindsay, Beatrice said gently. People don't change in 6 months. Especially people like Thomas. She paused. I know, Lindsay said softly. It's just that sometimes I feel very alone. Are you still seeing your therapist? Yes, it's helping, and thank you for the advice. After the conversation, Beatrice looked out the window for a long time. The workers were busy downstairs in the garden. She had finally decided to expand the greenhouse. Her gardening blog had become a real business, online consultations, webinars, and collaborations with gardening centers. The doorbell rang. A courier was at the door with a large envelope. Ms. Coleman, documents from your lawyer. Beatrice signed the receipt and opened the envelope, the final divorce papers. Officially, it was all over. Surprisingly, she felt neither joy nor sadness, only weariness. In the evening, Martha arrived with dinner. I thought today was a special day. We should celebrate. It's just paperwork, Beatrice replied, putting away the dishes. It's not freedom. By the way, have you seen the latest comments on your blog? Beatrice shook her head. I haven't had time. I've been working on my book this morning. Martha took out her phone. Listen, your articles on how to rebuild a garden after a storm helped me realize that my life can be rebuilt after a divorce. And there are dozens of comments like that. You know, Beatrice poured wine. Sometimes I wake up and think, is this really happening to me? I really managed to start over. My constant feeling that I'm not good enough. You know, Martha said, I've noticed you don't stumble over your words anymore. And you don't speak softly, apologizing for every word. Beatrice smiled. Psychotherapy works wonders, and said as being a strong woman. The next morning, Beatrice was working in the garden when a familiar car arrived. It was Thomas. What are you doing here? She asked. Still pruning the roses. I wanted to talk. He seemed confused. You look very beautiful. Thank you, but why did you come? I've been thinking a lot about us. About everything that's happened. Beatrice straightened up. Thomas, we're over. You know that. But 15 years. Yes. He looked her in the eyes. 15 years I lived with a man who didn't respect me. Who thought I wasn't worth anything? And you know what? I'm not that woman anymore. I've changed. He took a step forward. She didn't deny it. She just shook her head. You just feel alone and scared because, for the first time in your life, you have to face the consequences of your actions. It's not fair. Life isn't fair, Thomas. But you know what is fair? The fact that each of us has an opportunity to be better. I took mine. He hung his head. Lindsay isn't answering my calls. And rightly so. What am I supposed to do? Beatrice sighed. Start with therapy. Learn to see women as people, not as things to possess. And most importantly, leave me alone. That afternoon, she sat down in front of her computer to work on a new article not about gardens, but about life, about how important it is to notice the weeds in your life in time. Her phone blinked. A message from her editor. Your column on toxic relationships is breaking audience records. Readers are asking for more. Beatrice looked out the window. In the garden, new roses were blooming, the ones she had planted after the divorce, strong, resilient varieties that are not afraid of frost or heat. Months after the divorce, Beatrice was sitting in her office. A call interrupted her work. It was Lindsay, sounding worried. Thomas had tried to contact her, saying he'd changed, realized everything. Beatrice sighed, asking Lindsay how she felt. Lindsay wasn't sure if he'd truly changed, and felt alone. Beatrice, gently, reminded her that people don't change that quickly. Lindsay continued therapy, and thanked Beatrice for the advice. Beatrice later looked out the window. Workers were expanding her greenhouse, her blog was booming. A courier arrived with final divorce papers, officially ending everything. She felt neither joy nor sadness, only weariness. That evening, Martha arrived for dinner to celebrate. Beatrice was focused on her book. Martha pointed out the many supportive comments on Beatrice's blog. Beatrice admitted to still feeling inadequate at times. Martha noted her improved confidence and self-assuredness. The next morning, Thomas appeared in Beatrice's garden. He wanted to talk, admitting he hadn't respected her, and that she wasn't that woman anymore. He acknowledged his feeling of loneliness and fear, the consequences of his actions. Beatrice, while understanding his feelings, firmly asked him to leave her alone, reminding him that she'd taken the opportunity to become a better person. That evening, Beatrice worked on an article about toxic relationships. Her column was breaking readership records. She looked out at her garden. The new, strong roses symbolizing her own resilience and new beginning.